All right, is everybody here? Everybody ready? All right, so I'll start with top of case and I'll go on to our two contentions, one of which has some extra framework arguments at the top. My time begins now. We affirm the resolution. We weigh this debate on net benefits. Whichever side does the most good for the most people should win. The plan, like the actor, is the People's Republic of China, which is this house, and we just abandoned all claims on the Senkaku Islands. Advantage one is tensions, uniqueness. Number one, Japan and China tensions are high right now. Trade disputes and territorial disputes lead to a decrease in diplomacy. Number two is that the Senkaku Islands are a flashpoint. The Japanese government presents the nature of the Chinese challenge to its security, especially to the Senkaku Islands, in the strongest terms yet. Japanese Defense Minister Taro Kono made clear that the further intensification of activities might trigger the intervention of Japanese military assets. Three is that the US is mad also. They said that they would monitor the situation, which means they're poised to respond. Four is that both sides are ramping up their military presence in the region, and the risk of war breaking out due to miscalculation is increasing. War kills economies and can escalate into nuclear war, hurting everybody. B is links. Number one, first link is that China backing down takes away the source of the conflict. Subpoint A is that Japan and the US can take away their military ships now that there is no longer a Chinese threat in the region. Number two is a perceptive shift. China also shows they are more willing to allow people to have territory also. Internal link three is that there's going to be like better diplomacy between China and Japan, as well as China and the Western nations that support Japan, which will lead to increased trade. So our impacts, we have two. Number one is war. Critically, we have to understand that because there's so many military boats in the region, there's a very high chance of escalation where someone thinks that the other side has launched a missile at them, which leads for them to respond, and this leads to lots of bad things. Man doesn't check back, because if one country bombs the other country, they will just keep shooting back. It's going to be very bad. Impact two is trade. US-China trade is important. Japan-China trade is important. Increased relations leads to better trade, which leads to a better economy for everybody. Our second point is imperialism. So I'm going to start off with some framing arguments about why imperialism is important. Number one is that ideologies and epistemologies about imperialism are important because subpoint A, it skews policymaking, B, it warps our perception of knowledge, and C, it warps the education we receive from debate. Imperialist debate education leads to imperialist policies in the future. Framing argument two is that imperialism is both structural and big stick. It can lead to miscalculation and nuclear war, as well as structural violence against minorities and indigenous peoples. Three is that we thus argue that the team that best deconstructs imperialism should win this round. Onto uniqueness. So uniqueness one is that China is an imperialist power. Subpoint A is the Spratly Islands. There were many military, for example, there were many military bases built in the last 20 years on these islands. It's a disputed area, and its control is important for South China Sea trade, as $5.4 trillion in trade passes through the nation, like China is trying to imperialize this area. Two is that imperialism is tied to nationalism, especially with respect to Japan. Chinese entertainment consistently displays Japan as the bad guys in Chinese history, which they were, but it also uses to fuel nationalism and justify imperialism against other countries. Three is that you can cross-apply the uniqueness points from our first point, that this is a major focal point for Chinese imperialism. That China is expanding their military presence in the region. They're making, in their foreign policy, they're making it more clear that they really want these islands and they see it as critical as part of their expansion. And indeed, it's a flashpoint as such. So C is linked. So here I'll explain how our plan exactly solves for Chinese imperialism. And the first link is that China will be able to step down from the imperialist adventure. Subpoint A is that the invasion of the Senkaku Islands is encroachment on Japanese land. And thus, by taking away their military, by invading them less, they're not encroaching, which leads to stepping down from imperialism. Link two is that China is able to tone down aggressive policies, which makes diplomacy easier. Subpoint A is that countries like the US might be more willing to make deals in areas such as climate change, which is critical to solving the global crisis. Link three is a perceptive shift. The government tells the people and the world that it is shifting away from an imperialist mindset and more likely to work together with other nations. Onto impacts. Our first impact is environmental destruction. China uses an imperialist justification to burn large amounts of coal, and is the biggest polluter in the world right now because of the new coal factories and coal power plants being built right now. The justification is imperialism because China thinks that in order to imperialize other countries and expand their own territory, they have to like increase their own local production, and in this case it comes in the form of energy, which means that they have to burn all of these coal and gas. And additionally, the islands that China is trying to imperialize have significantly like high like gas and oil or coal reserves, and China would likely try to utilize these resources. So it's also a reason for Chinese imperialism. Impact 2 is biodiversity lost. The East China Sea has many unique aspects that are harmed by military actions, and the Senkaku Islands uniquely serve as one of the 2 nesting sites in the world for the vulnerable short-tailed albatross. Indeed, all of the military action that is happening in the area as a result of imperialism, as a result of imperialist powers fighting each other, will ultimately lead to the destruction of these ecological species, especially keystone species, which can lead to the entire collapse of whole ecosystems. Impact 3 is that it's the root cause of oppression. Subpoint A is structural violence. Chinese oppression of Uyghurs show that imperialism and structural violence often go hand in hand, which means that imperialism just has really bad impacts for a lot of minorities in the area. B is adding onto this, even though like there's no like native inhabitants on the Senkaku Islands, the fact is that Chinese imperialism ultimately leads to structural violence, and by preventing imperialism, by preventing the imperialization of the Senkaku Islands, we're going to be able to decrease structural violence as well. Subpoint B is ontological death, as imperialized lands are stripped of their individuality and their cultures. Again, like there's no people here, but it's still preventing imperialism in the first place. Impact 4 is mercantilism. Mercantilism is the worst economic system. It means that the imperialist country will take extreme measures to economically exploit the resources of the imperialized areas. Imperialist nations compete for dominance against each other. This critically makes war inevitable as countries fight for resources, fight for hegemony, and fight for control. For example, there's going to be resource conflicts over fish and fossil fuels in the Senkaku Islands. We can tie this back to my first point. I have 30 seconds left. I'll take any POIs if you have them. I know I probably spoke a bit too fast in the first contention.
This motion says this House, as China, would abandon all claims. How in any way are all of the impacts you outlined to us pertinent to China as the actor in this debate? Like, why are all these things should be considered, given that we are taking the viewpoint of China?
I have very limited time here, but the weighing mechanism is net benefits for the most people. Even though the actor is China, that doesn't mean we have to like just kind of structurally kill all these other people. China still cares about other people that don't live in China. Like lives should still be valuable. And either way, we tell you that war leads to miscalculation, which leads to death for Chinese citizens as well, and nuclear war can like basically kill like millions in China, so it's not good for China.
All right, before I begin, can everyone hear me all right? Great. My name is Ambika Grover. I'll be the leader of opposition from GHS, and if everyone's all set, I'll start my time. From the last government speech, it's evident we need to take a moment to look what the motion is actually asking us. This House, as China, would abandon all claims on the Senkaku Islands. What this debate isn't about, all of China's human rights abuses that aren't occurring on the Senkaku Islands. And just to make this debate a bit more productive, I'm going to start by clarifying what actually the Senkaku Islands are, what the nature of the conflict is. Then I'm going to talk about Gov's case, then go into Op's case. But let's actually start by classifying the nature of the situation in which we are dealing upon. In April of 1992, 14 years after Japan laid its claim to the Senkaku Islands, China, in a press conference, enacted the law on the territorial sea and contiguous zone of the People's Republic of China. And what that law said is that it incorporated the Senkaku Islands onto its own territory. But the second thing I want to note is that abandoning all claims on the Senkaku Islands necessarily means that China is completely saying this land doesn't belong to us. But panel, it's really important for you to recognize the importance of going by what the motion is actually asking us to be. We would agree that things like structural violence exhibited by China are harmful, that imperialism generally can be a bad thing. But the problem and the question we're being asked to debate in this motion is what we would do as China, seeing that China's objectives are to expand its hegemony across the world, to increase its global influence and power. That is the meat and crux of the debate we are having today. With that out of the way, I'm going to start by going down the case on side government. The first argument was on tensions. A couple of things here. First of all, they give you this idea about conflict between Japan and China and how that's like an inherently bad thing. But a couple of things I want to say on this. First of all, I want to say this idea of like Chinese hegemony, like just all of this idea about their imperialism being like such a bad thing, all of these things are not explicitly linked to why giving up a small series of uninhabited islands in the East, like China Sea, is somehow going to lead to decreased Chinese imperialism in other parts of the world. This was a huge misnomer. We're talking about these islands, which are within 1,000 kilometers of China Sea. Giving that up doesn't necessitate that they're going to completely turn around and become a completely democratically principled country. But the second thing they talk about are tensions with other nations. But this kind of goes back to the resolutional analysis I give you at the top of my speech, which is that when we're talking about tensions, we have to be evaluating on this based on what's actually best for China. Again, this house as China, what is actually going to happen? We see that when China uniquely pulls out of the situation, when it says, oh no, those claims are no longer ours, you're increasing the tension of things like already occurring in the status quo, where the United States is collaborating with Japan by showing off their military ships near the region and occupying things like that. I'll talk about this more in my case. But our next response to this is on the idea of better diplomacy. I think the better diplomacy argument is greatly undercut by the fact that China saying, oh, we totally back off from this region is opening the door for it to like lose its credibility in other regions of the world. Look to conflicts even in the South China Sea, Kashmir, and other parts of the globe where China's word matters. But when China goes on to say, oh, no, you can have it all back, we think it undermines their credibility and overall hurts their hegemony in the first place. Now, their second argument, they talk about imperialism. This is like dealt with a lot of the analysis I give you, but I just want to bring this up again. First of all, not once do they explain why the Senkaku Islands are chiefly responsible for Chinese hegemony. We would rather tell you it's things like the Belt and Road Initiative on other parts of the globe that are uniquely causing this exhibition of hegemony in the first place. But second, they talk about this idea of like oppression against minorities. Okay, first of all, these islands are uninhabited. People are not even living on them. The primary like debate is just over geopolitical like imaging and furthermore resources, nothing to do with minority rights. Like this is not the debate we're having today. Okay, then all of their impacts about the environment, furthermore, they just filled with assertions, frankly, that China is going to back down on its environmental standards, when in reality, we think, like the Senkaku Island involvement, there is like nothing going on in terms of the environment there. There's only resources there. We just didn't follow what they were saying here. I want to transfer back to the opposition side of the debate with our first disadvantage on how government gives strategic advantage to China's enemies. The first layer into this argument is on the Japan-United States alliance. The Japan and the United States have been close allies since the end of the Second World War. They're both tied closely politically and militarily. Japan has already laid a claim to the Senkaku Islands. That is to say, the instant China says, oh no, the Senkaku Islands are no longer ours, Japan has fully gained the right to these islands from the perspective of geopolitical stance. In fact, we've already seen that Japan and the US have actively been using their military to show aggression against China. Lieutenant Gen Kevin Schneider essentially exhibited the ability and publicly released a statement that they would deliver combat troops to defend the Senkakus or respond to other crises. We think as China, you're succumbing to those abilities and admitting that those things are okay. US gaining power in the region, incredibly damaging to China. Second layer onto this argument is proximity to China. The Senkaku Islands, just looking at a map, are incredibly close to China. They're essentially within a few thousand kilometers of China, a little bit closer to Taiwan, and Japan is much farther off. We think that this unique zone of giving access to this region and admitting that Japan and US have full access poses a strategic threat and essentially concede that microaggressions against China are okay. We see that this has similar implications in the US-Taiwan's relationship, and China essentially is actively fighting to keep Taiwan in its own power, and we think that this defense zone is likely also to be harmed just by the actions of prior military people. Third layer into this argument is that there is an improbability for response in the status quo. Government tries to paint this picture about how there's so much tension and so much conflict in the region, but we want to point out for a few things. First, these islands are entirely uninhabited, so all of their impacts about people like dying and stuff like that have nothing to do with this round because people don't live on that island in the first place. But second of all, we would tell you that Tokyo in the status quo has been like quite unresponsive in terms of getting angry with China. They didn't actually exhibit and materialize how this aggression occurs in the first place. Second argument in this round is on geopolitical strength. A few layers to this argumentation. First, on weakness. China is a dominant regional country, and any signs of backing down on their part are going to cause a deterioration of their word. Cross-apply this to areas like Kashmir, claims in the South China Sea, and even in the context of North Korea. Claims of China to other parts of the globe are no longer going to have the same meaning. The second subpoint under this argument is that of security. China is a global powerhouse, and the security of it is directly tied to its borders. Similar to the concessions that the USSR made in their satellite states, this erodes the power and influence of a nation that was chiefly responsible for why the USSR started to fall, because it started to make these concessions in the first place. Third layer to this argument is Taiwan. If soldiers from China's People's Liberation Army ensconce themselves in the archipelago, they would likely hold like a flanking position. So what we would tell you is that when you give this region to the United States and Japan, you're also increasing the likelihood of individuals from Taiwan now coming to this region. Third argument is on resource advantages. Two key ideas under this. The first, the prevalence of oil in the region, and second, like the maritime environment here. We would tell you that the East China Sea is rich in oil and gas reserves. This is one of the reasons why China wanted to have access to the Senkaku Islands in the first place, because they knew that, oh, there's going to be a lot of resources here. We think that China and Japan are both eager to stake a claim, and China's energy demand is growing rapidly, which means it has a huge demand for the oil available in that region. But the second layer is on the maritime availability of these things. Thousands of fish are available in the region, which can prove to be a huge boon for agriculture in both China and Japan. We say, as China, it's important that China gets access to those resources we are so proud to oppose.
Member of government, I suppose. Off-time roadmap. I'm going to start on top of case over the discussion of what the burden for each side is, and then I'm going to defend my own case and then opponent case. My time starts now. So first, on the top of case, my opponent makes this big point about how this house talks about how China, and that it's like the motion is talking about, or the resolution is talking about how this house as China, and therefore the debate is about what China would do, and like as China as the actor. But the thing is, yes, we should debate what China should do. And the thing is, our points are talking about how the action of China reducing its territorial claims on the Senkaku Islands will benefit China. Remember that net benefits is for everyone, because number one, China is benefited by these actions, but two, everyone else is benefited by these actions, because as China, we are going to be enacting things that are not going to just benefit China, but they're going to benefit the world as well. And Judge, when you were considering the weighing of this debate in the end, you need to consider not only the effects for China, but the effects on the world, which side does the most net good. If the actor was the United States, for example, we would still oppose imperialism, even if it benefits the US a bit in the short term. Chinese people are harmed by imperialism. That's the crux of our case. The war makes people have to go to war. Escalation leads to nuclear war. And they made some sort of the precedent was that China wanted the Senkaku Islands based on like previous territorial claims and stuff. But obviously this would be solved by simply China pulling back from the islands. Now on our case itself, they said on our tensions point, they said that tensions have to be evaluated based on what is best for China. And so then they said tensions increase because Japan Japan feels more powerful because like China gave them a concession. But the thing is, this simply does not make sense, because tensions are increasing because there is conflict over the islands between China and Japan, and by extension the United States. The entire reason that tensions are escalating right now is because there are two countries fighting over a disputed area. Once one country gains control of said disputed area, then there's not going to be that conflict anymore, because the issue has been settled. If China stops wanting the land, there's going to be any tensions. Furthermore, you have to extend the fact that these islands are currently a flashpoint for further activity, because according to the Japanese Defense Minister Taro Kono, made it clear that further intensification of activities might trigger the intervention of U.S. military assets. Judges, this is a flashpoint for activity in the region. If things continue to increase, they will only get worse. But if we back down now, we are going to be able to ease tensions. Furthermore, there's no risk for Japan feeling more powerful and becoming more aggressive, because regardless, China still has ultimate military hegemony over like Japan and by extension the United States. Like the Chinese Navy has more naval vessels than the entire United States Navy, and the Japanese Navy is like completely pales in comparison. On our better diplomacy with Japan point, and their response was that it, like, China backing off makes China lose credibility around the world. But the thing is, China backing off from imperialism does not necessarily reduce its power, because imperialism is actually harming China's power in the long term. Furthermore, imperialism hurts the credibility of China. For example, the United States is going to view China as an evil imperialist actor. The Western world, and like the United States and like a lot of people in the West, are viewing China negatively. If China is taking actions to reduce its imperialist like behavior, then all the countries are going to recognize, oh, China is now working to become a more Western nation. They're not being evil, they're not being imperialist. They're going to start seeing China in a more negative light. The impact of this is trade, because once we have better diplomatic connections, we can have more free trade with China, Japan, and the United States once tensions are less, and this free trade will ultimately benefit the global economy, helping expedite any recovery from economic problems caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. On imperialism, they say their blanket response to the imperialism point is basically that like the imperialism does not imperialism isn't relevant, and like 3 small islands aren't going to be like doing anything with imperialism. But this ignores the entire point. The entire point is that reducing China reducing its own imperialism is good for the people of China. And why is this? Well, as we stated earlier, China has a history of being imperialist, and China currently is imperialist. But by stepping down, China shows other countries that they're not being as imperialist. China makes diplomacy easier because other countries recognize that China is not nearly being as aggressive, and that this is a perceptive shift showing that other countries should be willing to step down from imperialism, and therefore easing global tensions. In response to this, or these sort of things, my opponent, the other thing that you have to consider is the fact that my opponent basically just ignores our links by saying that imperialism is not relevant, because we have in fact shown that it is relevant, and my opponent, by simply saying it's not, does not actually refute any of our connections that we have built. Furthermore, they said things like the Belt and Road Initiative caused hegemony, but you have to extend the fact that imperialism comes first, and even if even if there's other things in the world that are greater contributions to Chinese imperialism, there are things in this round that we have to consider and we have to evaluate because they tie to imperialism. Now, on China backing down from its environmental policy and environmental destruction, they said like China is not going to change the environment, but this is a perceptive shift away from imperialism, and that even though they're small islands, as we proved, they're currently a flashpoint, and they're currently very important. The magnitude of the impact served to prove that imperialism is the biggest impact in the round. Even if you buy my opponent's point that the islands are uninhabited and therefore like some of our ontological death points are irrelevant, the magnitude of the impact still outweigh, because environmental collapse and nuclear war, miscalculation, mercantilism, this supports the role of the ballot that we propose in the framework arguments, that the team that best deconstructs imperialism and works against it should win this round, and therefore we destruct imperialism better. On the opponent case, my opponent says their first contention is strategic advantage to Japan and the United States. They said that like Japan and the United States are allying to show military strength against China, and that like the Senkaku Islands are close to China. But number one, using military strength to show forth to China is basically an arms race at this point, because China is at the same time building up its own forces to counter the building forces from Japan and the United States in this disputed area. If China backs down, there's not going to be this arms race, and there's not going to be this like massive surge, because Japan and the United States have no interest in like just directly attacking China, because of the rules of nuclear destruction. Either way, everyone will die. Two, they said that since the Senkaku Islands are close to China and therefore pose a strategic risk to China, but a few thousand kilometers is not close at all. You know what else is a few thousand kilometers from China? The islands of Japan. On links level, they say that Japan gains the island, and that's like a strategic threat to the proximity. But number one, Japan cannot invade China even with the assistance of the United States. China is like one of if not the world's most populous country. It is one of the world's largest militaries. It's highly advanced, and there's no way that a island nation, even with the support of another major global power, is going to be able to invade China successfully. Furthermore, China can still patrol the area with ships if it gets too dangerous. Just because China pulls back its territorial claims in this region does not mean that China is ineligible to have any sort of military involvement in the region. On their geopolitical strength point, they say that China has to show strength, and that like China will look weak But again, China is still the world's most dominant military power, and they still have plenty of hegemony, regardless if they pull back and they show like restraint from imperialism and therefore benefit their diplomatic position. On their third environment point, they're like resources point, they say that like it has oil and gas and that fish are beneficial, but oil and gas are terrible for the environment, and limiting China's use of them is actually good because it forces China to find better solutions that will help prevent the climate crisis that is imminent. Thank you.
All right, can everybody hear me? All right, is everybody ready? Does anyone need a minute? All right, then I will begin my time now. Hello, judge and fellow debaters. My name is Arjun Kishore, and alongside my partner Ambika, I'll be on the side of this motion. Just to outline this case, I'm going to start with framing, then move down the affirmatives case, and then move into the opposition's case. All right, first to start with framing, just to clear up some ideas. We, seeing China as the main actor in this, we believe that this house should be China, and we still are, we addressed the framework and said that the importance, since the important actor is China, we should be addressing it to be China and not the net benefit. Now, just to provide some additional reasoning as to why net benefits is not inclusive enough at China, this means that any secessions that China make that benefit other countries should be weighed as a positive in the world of affirmative, which is to say any action that harms China but benefits another country would still be good in the affirmatives world, which is to say that they are not looking at the interest of China. For that reason, we should solely be looking at the interest of China as it is the actor and main stakeholder in this debate. All right, now to move into the affirmatives case. The first argument they present is tensions. They talked about how Chinese-Japanese tensions were from the Senkaku Islands. Now, to be clear, a long history of Chinese and Japanese tensions has existed. The Senkaku Islands are one small minority of this. But even still, you, judge, might believe that this is a source of some tension. And to that, we don't necessarily disagree. However, there's a few main reasons why their argument on this falls flat. First of all is the idea that by ceding the region, it decreases tensions. This is not the case. As we provide numerous other examples, because of the strategic location of the Senkaku Islands, it actually increases Western world pressure on China. For example, look at Taiwan. We provide you the historical example of the USSR to show that this actually increases tensions in the region. The mutual assured pressure between China and US actually keeps the region more stable than if one country had absolute control on it. And they talked about how further activity is violence. They cite a quote, for example, from the Japanese minister. But to be clear, Judge, in the motion, we are not advocating for further action. We are advocating for the current status quo, in which case China is not significantly increasing its presence in the region. It's not like there's military action in the region. We are talking about solely a claim, not the military action that potentially could occur years in advance. Finally, they talk about how China has the ultimate military, but as we'll go to talk about, having an ultimate military isn't necessarily decreasing tensions because there's not a perpetual threat of an enormous military invasion. So having this strategic location actually still provides a ton of pressure. All of this sums up, Judge, however, is that they never explicitly link the enormous tension of the region to the Senkaku Islands. They never explicitly say how this small 3-island will actually have a significant change on the tensions of the region. And as we proved by seeding it, there's a power vacuum that the United States will take, which increases the tension. All right, now into the second point regarding imperialism. Now, to be clear, Judge, imperialism happens when one country expands into another, abuses the resources and people within that country, and assimilates it within its own country. To be clear, Judge, this one is an uninhabited island that two, China is not on. So any claim that this is Chinese imperialism is reckless because it goes beyond the definition of what imperialism is. This does not apply and is not able to be defined as imperialism. They talk about how the US uses imperialism to vilify China. Now, beyond the fact that this doesn't even imply as imperialism, I think it's reckless to say that because of this sole move, China would not be villainized. In fact, within the United States, China is not villainized for the Senkaku Islands. It's villainized for its economy, its political leaders. It's villainized for Taiwan and numerous other things. Now, another thing that they talk about is how decreasing imperialism, which as I made clear, is not imperialism whatsoever. But even if you do buy that, they say that it will make the China more like the Western countries. And Judge, I think this ultimately clues you into exactly what affirmative wants to do. What affirmative wants is for China to be like the United States. What affirmative wants is for China to be like the Western countries. And that is essentially destroying the culture and politics in entirely the country of China. Seeing that we are the stakeholder of China and the identity of China is central to our power, it is clear that affirmative wants to destroy the identity of China, which should be an ultimate part of the debate. It should tell you, Judge, that affirmative is not concerned whatsoever with China. They talk about how there will be a perceptive shift, but they never explicitly explain how this perceptive shift will change with the Senkaku Islands. And we give you the link that the perception of China is not linked to the Senkaku Islands, but overall its politics in other locations. The ultimate impact they provide here is imperialism. But as I have told you, Judge, this is not an example of imperialism. China does not have resources on that country. Even if you do buy that it decreases the geopolitical power of China, then that is a negative harm. That is a harm of China. So with that said, I now want to move into our case. Now, just to outline, in the case, some points that were dropped. The majority of the second contention was dropped. Specifically, the argument we make regarding security in Taiwan was dropped simply because a military is powerful. It does not mean that there is no threat against it, right? You can look to the proximity of the Senkaku Islands for that. You can look to the USSR for that. You can look to the Cuban Missile Crisis. All of this prove that a small piece of land can be an enormous threat. They cede all of these impacts. The third argument we make as well is ceded. They only say that environmental impacts are greater, but again, they never explicitly link the environmental impact to the Senkaku Islands. The only impact they provide is that ships will go in the region, but in their own case, they say that China should still keep ships in the region regardless of their claim. So that the only environmental impact they have is non-unique. Judge, what's clear is that they cede both our second and third contention. Now I want to move into our first contention regarding the strategic advantage. The first point they provide on this is that there's an arms race in the region. Now, we would contest this argument entirely because once again, look towards the resolution when we're talking about the claims of China in the region. But Judge, even if you do buy the idea that somehow both countries are enormously proliferating their weapons solely because of this small 3-island region, even if you do buy that argument, in an arms race, what incentive would China have to drop out? If you say that peace will exist, you can look in the status quo and see that there is already peace within that region. What it does do, however, is enormously harm the geopolitical strength of China. And that, I think, is key in this. Overall, affirmative offers really just two main ideas to refute the strategic advantage. That it will make the region, rather one main idea, that it will make the region peaceful. And this is important, Judge, for two main reasons. First of all, it cedes the fact that we are China. They drop our geopolitical impact, which is to say the impact we provide about the strength of China's word. All they say is that China's word is enormously powerful, but that's exactly our point. It's enormously powerful because it has backing. So because of that, you should move forward the impact of the geopolitical strength of China's word decreasing. Now, in terms of the actual legitimate threat of a lack of security in that region, again, look towards two main ideas. First of all, the fact that the region is peaceful. The region is not seeing violence. The region is not seeing violence between these two countries. But second of all, that ceding this creates a power vacuum, which will actually make tensions worse. But by giving the United States and Japan this sort of free threat onto China, it actually weakens Chinese power. Judge, there's one key idea on this debate that you should remember. We are evaluating as China. The affirmative has repeatedly ceded the idea that China will become weaker. And the only response they have is that we will avoid cataclysmic impacts such as imperialism as war. But since they never explicitly link either imperialism, which doesn't even apply, or war, which as we have proven is impossible to happen, you should vote for op. Judge, if you value China and you think China should maintain its strategic power and geopolitical influence, vote for op. Thank you.
All right, is everyone all set? Okay. I'll start time now. Unfortunately, it seems like this debate has taken the course of revolving around the framework, but just to condense this debate, I'm going to be talking about how in either world, on both the framework government presents you, on or on opposition, we think we still win. I want to start by breaking down this debate onto two key ideas, that of tensions and second, that of imperialism and the Chinese people, before going over just like a top-level analysis on different frameworks and why we think opposition prevails under either. Let's first start with this area of tensions. And the first kind of point of contentions is how Japan and China's tensions are rising the status quo. That's an inherently harmful thing. There's a couple of things here. First of all, at no point in the debate did government actually materialize as to what the consequences of this tension are. They use the word tension arbitrarily, but fail to recognize that A, there's not even people on that island who are suffering from such tensions in the first place. Second of all, like they didn't really engage with the harms of giving up that area. And third, Arjun's analysis, which he just gave you, which is the idea that giving Japan and the US like control of an island, which is, by the way, quite close to China in comparison to Japan, how that's intrinsically more anxiety-inducing for countries like China, makes them more on edge, and in fact increases the probability of a misunderstood ship passing by close to China, and increases the probability of conflict in the first place. We think on this point they didn't actually engage with the crux of this argumentation, insofar as they couldn't actually materialize tangibly what this conflict is and why it's so bad in the status quo. We tell you it gets worse. The second idea was this idea like, oh, Western nations are going to have more influence in the region. The problem with government's case down the bench has been that of magnitude, how they failed to equivocate having simply 3 more islands in the East China Sea, somehow leading to China completely taking a step back. In fact, we would say on probability, we outweigh. At no point in the debate did they say how somehow China saying we no longer have claims to this island necessarily means they're going to do the same reciprocal action across the globe. We think it actually has a decreased likelihood. China's more likely to be on edge by the fact of giving up territory and all in all take away resources that would otherwise be given to the people and use them again just for putting troops next to the border where those islands are. Now the second point of clash in this debate was that of imperialism and the Chinese people. I think Arjun does a really good job explaining why we think imperialism in this debate doesn't even have a space, given that the areas are inhabited in the first place. But to even take this one step further, we would say that Chinese imperialism is actually not impacted by this at all, but furthermore would say that this idea that China will just give up all of its lands and claims and is just going to become a Western nation, like Arjun said, harms the culture of China and takes away their uniqueness. Furthermore, we would say that having access to resources like oil, which they drop the fact that China's in desperate need of having oil for its people, actually makes the people better off. And finally, just on their environment impact, I think that we can first of all, they didn't actually materialize or quantify in any way whatsoever how having ships are there. Second, we would say it would be offset by the presence of Japan and the US in the region. In my last minute of time, I want to do a top-level analysis on the 2 frameworks in this debate. What government has been telling you in the entirety of this debate essentially said, oh, we should look at net benefits and net benefits to the people of China. What we told you in this round was rather that we should be looking at this from the perspective of China and what's going to best help its geopolitical stance. But let's talk about government's position in this round. Essentially what they tell you is that China is going to become more like Western nations by giving up 3 islands. We think we outweigh on probability here, because we think that the probability of a global hegemonic power like China just giving away 3 islands and totally doing a structural upheaval of its system is incredibly marginally low. We just look empirically and see that China has not exhibited that sign before. This is clearly a change, of course, in policy. So we think on that way, they lose the round on that. But then let's go on to what we tell you. We told you that this is going to lead to more contentious and more tensions within China writ large, because now that China has stepped back, other parts of the world are going to be more willing to challenge China, whether this be in regions like Kashmir or even in the South China Sea. Weakening China only increases tensions in that respect. We think it's a clear ballot for opposition and urge you to vote with us.
All right, now is my speech. Okay, right. So 5 minutes. I'm gonna start on their case and then go on to our case and then go to weighing. Yeah. So top down for the neg, top down for the app. Do some weighing for both sides. My time begins now. The first 2 contentions of strategic advantage and geopolitical strength are very similar, so I will repeat them as one. They say again and again that this area matters a lot to China, that it's only 1,000 kilometers away, and that it's going to allow the Western nations to be able to have more strength against China and further military conflicts. But you simply have to buy here our terminal defense, and it's just not close enough to China to matter at all. It's about as close to China as Japan is, so it's not going to have any influence on and especially since they're very small and they're uninhabited and they're not as strong as like the Spratly Islands, it's not going to cause this huge geopolitical failure of China and this huge like lack of strength. They really don't have that many impacts. Also, I want to point out a contradiction to the negation case. If you buy that it has geopolitical importance, and you can extend the fact that it is definitely a high flashpoint for tensions. If China really cares about this geopolitically because it really matters to China, then it's pretty obvious that they're going to be very tensionous about it. They're really going to be angry if they're really going to try their best and try to build up this arms race in order to procure it. And then on their environment point, they say that like environmental impacts aren't linked because like we're still gonna have like ships patrolling the region so that China stays safe. But the point of the ships is to like is that if the Western nations continue adding ships on their side in order to use the geopolitical wedge in order to screw China over even more, then China can then use ships to defend. So the point is that China always has the option to use ships, but they definitely will not because Western nations will back up as well. So the environment point is a wash. Onto our case. So on our tensions point, they're again and again their reputation at this point is that like tensions aren't high. Like this is definitely not a flashpoint for tensions, but it obviously is. Look to our uniqueness about how like Japan is going to increase military intervention. They say that like, oh, but then in the school like China is not increasing military action, but China is. The entire point, as they say, of China's foreign policy is to increase the geopolitical power and strength of China. And as we see, China is currently, like as we speak, ramping up the amount of military ships and military planes patrolling the region, which means that in the scroll, invariably, Japan will increase it too. So there's still going to be a chance of war. And so you have to extend the fact that this place is a flashpoint, and that pretty much by common sense, if you decrease it, you're going to be able to decrease tensions. The critical link to why this causes more peace is that it improves Western citizens' perception of China. They'll see China as more of a rational being because right now in the media there's a lot of demonization of China. China is this crazy like country that just invades everybody and kills human rights and everything. But when China like changes a tiny bit and shows that they are willing to change, then it's going to lead to a massive increase in perception, which leads to a massive increase in trade and diplomacy and cooperation. All of this leads back into better trade, better quality of life, and also better cooperation for the climate, as my partner brought up. On imperialism, critically, we extend the framing arguments. We extend that our impacts, the magnitude of our impacts, make imperialism the biggest, our epistemological impacts and our material impacts make imperialism the biggest impact of this round. And they drop the role of the ballot accordingly. They concede that a 1% chance of decreasing Chinese imperialism outweighs the entire negation case, simply because the impacts of imperialism are so great. Again, just to say imperialism again, like it leads to invariable environmental destruction, it leads to biodiversity destruction, it leads to oppression and mercantilism, which ends in war and extinction. So again, this is the biggest impact in this round, and the link here, which they try to refute again, the link again is that China basically does this big 180-degree turn from its current foreign policy, which benefits its international image and fixes imperialism. So they say that this is like going to destroy like Chinese culture and politics and destroy the identity of China. But pretty obviously, China being slightly less aggressive does not mean that China is going to like ontologically die. But also we have to understand that China needs to let go of the parts of its identity that make environmental destruction and war inevitable. They don't respond to the actual magnitude of these impacts. The culture is definitely important, and there still can be culture that is not part of the imperialist mindset. However, being alive and having a world in which nuclear war has not been guaranteed is far more important than being able to like preserve your very, very old culture, right? So onto weighing. So the negation side goes for probability. They say that like, oh, like our chance has our geopolitical impacts have a slightly higher chance of happening, and that means that we should win the debate. But I say that we have to weigh magnitude first, and here's why. COVID. So COVID was a high magnitude, low probability impact that we disregarded. We were like, oh, this is probably not going to happen. There's probably not going to be this giant like epidemic that kills everybody. So we disregarded it, but then it happened. And now we're in the pandemic and there's millions that are suffering. The economy is dipping. We have to have debate on Zoom now instead of in person. It's a lot less fun. And so we have to regard these high magnitude impacts because they will actually invariably come true. And we see that imperialism is already coming true and will continue to come true unless we do the F. Thank you, and urge a strong vote for the affirmation.